So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan White, who has spent over a decade researching and writing his soon-to-be-released book, Tides. His first book, Talking on Waters, is available next door at Darville's, and it's a conversation about nature and creativity. He has written on a variety of topics that have appeared in, you guys ready? Christian Science Monitor, The Sun, Sierra, Whole Earth Review, Fine Home Building.
And Orion.
And Orion. Yeah, let's not forget Orion. Besides being a writer, he is also a sailor, educator, marine conservationist, custom home builder, and most importantly, a husband and a father. Without any further ado, Jonathan White.
As some of you may know, this is a little preliminary because the book isn't due out for another year. I actually am not finished writing it. And when I agreed to do this talk, it was last summer, and I thought, well, for sure I'll be done by then. But I have sailed past so many deadlines. But nevertheless, I have one more chapter to write, and that is due the first part of March. And then it goes to peer review, and it takes them a full year to produce the book. It's Trinity University Press. And so the due date, right, or the release date right now is next year this time. So I feel a little bit like I've been a mad scientist in tinkering in my garage, and that this is just, I think, the second talk I've given on the subject. And it's almost like the garage doors come up and suddenly I've got to see if this thing flies somehow. And so I feel a little bit like a deer in the headlights, but here we are, and thank you again so much for coming. Does anybody know what that is up there? So, yes, that's a tidal bore, which is when the flooding tide goes up a river in the shape of a wave. And this happens to be the largest tidal bore in the world. There are hundreds of these, well, over 100 of these, let's say, worldwide. And this is the largest one, the Chentong River, and it gets up to 25 feet tall. And that's another shot of it. So every fall they have a festival around watching the tidal bore, and millions of people, literally millions of people from China, some people from the Europe area, go to see this thing, and often there are accidents. People are swept away to their death, and it's a real public nuisance in a lot of ways for the people who monitor this. But this thing has been happening on the Chentong River for 2,500 years, and there's all kinds of myths about it. And I went over there 3 times and wrote one of the chapters about this. From being I grew up on the coast, and I've been a sailor and a surfer and diver for a lot of years, and I've been infatuated with the ocean for all those years. Thank you. And I built a small boat out of college, a 26-foot sloop, and I sailed that boat down to the Caribbean and made some offshore passages, and kind of cut my teeth on that boat, got into a lot of trouble in offshore storms and so forth. And then in the early 80s, I sold that boat, and I came back up here, actually to Seattle, and I was going to go back to graduate school, and I was looking around for a program, and I happened to see a picture of a big old wooden schooner for sale down in Tillamook, Oregon. So I went down to see it, and it was painted all orange and leaked about 150 gallons a day. It was stuck in the mud down there, and it was perfect. And so I bought the boat and brought it up to Seattle and started a school, a nonprofit educational organization called Resource Institute. That was back in 82, 83. And for 11 years, we ran seminars on that boat, from the Seattle area all the way up to Alaska. And I figured during those years, we were underway for almost 7 months out of the year. We had various other skippers, I was one of them, and crew. And what we do is we bring a presenter on board, a poet, a writer, a naturalist, a photographer, and so forth. And they would be typically on the boat for a week, and then we'd have paying participants, and then we'd go off and do something for a week. And we'd start up in the Queen Charlotte Islands, or Haida Gwaii now, and Alaska, Ketchikan, Sitka, Juneau, Petersburg, and all the way through here as well. And so some of the people we had on board, you'd recognize Paul Winter, did the music, and Robert Bly, William Stafford, Gary Snyder, Lynn Margulis, Gretel Ehrlich. We even had a seminar scheduled with, I'm forgetting his name right now, but I'll come back to that in a second. Anyway, so we had a lot of very good times, but we had a couple of not so fun times on that boat. And one of those was up in Kalinin Bay on the north tip of Kruzof Island. And that's just outside of Sitka. And we had just come in from a seminar and anchored, and in the night a large gale blew. Woke me up. I was down in the engine room, and I got up to relieve myself off the stern, which we often did. And I was standing there, and something didn't feel right. And those of you who know boats know that when you're floating, the boat feels like it's floating. There's a softness, there's a sponginess. But when it's not floating, there's a hardness to it, and a resonance that's really different. And I'm sure none of you know that feeling. And I confess I know that feeling a lot more than that one time. But something was wrong, so I went up into the pilot house and grabbed the tide chart to see what was going on. And I thought, okay, so if the tide is low and about to come in, it'll be like any other event on the boat. It's like we just float off in a couple hours or whatever, and that would be the end of it. But if the tide was high and about to go down, we would be in serious trouble. And it was a seminar, we had paying guests on board and so forth. Well, we were at the peak of the high. And I thought, are you kidding me? And I read it a number of times, and it's true. We were at the peak, and the tide over the next 6-7 hours would go down 12 feet. And Crusader would go dry almost. So we got everybody off the boat and got them to shore, and there was bear sign all over. So Richard Nelson, who's an anthropologist and writer who lives in Sitka, or lived in Sitka at that time, stood by with a rifle. My dad, who had had a stroke a few months earlier, was on board, and he was there. We got everybody off board except for a couple of us. And as the morning wore on, Crusader did indeed go all the way down, but she got stuck in the mud. So when the tide turned, she didn't want to come back up. So she started to fill with water. So we are swimming through the inside of the boat this time. It's a 65-foot schooner on its side, filled with water. And I mean, we were trying to salvage some valuable stuff, but the engine, which is about twice the size of that table, and painted all red, big diesel. I watched the tide lap to the oil pan, and then come up and take over the batteries, and then up over the injectors, and finally I saw it just disappear in the turbid water. And the lots of food storage that we had, the bananas and apples and oranges and prunes came up and started to float through the cabins, and as the morning wore on, we still had them everywhere, and some of them were half-eaten because we were just grabbing little bites. And the rice was swirling like herring balls around the quarter berths. And then the books, we had 400 books on board, and the books swelled with water and started floating around too, and actually became a little bit of a hazard because they're so heavy when they're swollen, and there were some funny titles that drifted by that day, like Ram Dass, How Can I Help? And Ed Ricketts, Between Pacific Tides. And Robert Bly, I remember When Sleepers Awake. And Leela, one of the crew that was helping me out, at one point she appeared in the engine room door and lifted up this soap copy of Maxine Kumin's in deep. So that was Crusader. So she did eventually float, and we actually got the engine running and got back to Sitka. And 3 days of solid work, we got her back going, and she actually went out with the next sound. And we stripped the whole insides and actually hosed it down. We got a pressure washer, started, just stripped the whole thing, rewired it in 3 days. So I have been interested in tides for a long time. I knew the moon had something to do with it, and I really did want to know how it happened, but the Klingon Bay incident spurred me on, and I thought, okay, well, I'll read a couple of books, and that'll be enough. And I started reading, and I was amazed because the more I read, the more complex and fascinating and mysterious and poetic it became. And 2 books turned into 4 and 5, and pretty soon, right now I have over 300 sitting on my desk. But I wrote a article for Orion magazine, and then I got a contract with Natural History magazine to write about the Chinton tidal bore. And then I stopped writing for a while, got married and had a child and so forth in here. And then the subject wouldn't leave me alone, so about 5 years ago I committed to writing the book. So the Coast Guard brought pumps for us to pump out underneath the boat. So they're on land, obviously, and the land actually comes right to within 5 feet of the boat. So there are many themes to this book, but basically it's an exploration of tides, science and culture, mythology, ancient and modern history, and spirit. For each chapter I travel somewhere where some tide element is dramatically at work. So for tides, for the large tides, I went to the Arctic. For a spiritual history and cultural history, I went to Mont Saint-Michel. For the tidal bore, I went to China. For large tides, I went to the Arctic and the Bay of Fundy. And for a chapter on tide energy, I went to Scotland, northern Scotland, and then down to Chile. Because Scotland's at the leading edge of all that, and Chile's just starting to all of it. So in my research, I found obviously lots of myths about the tides, and it's interesting. There's all kinds of ways to divide up the story or the study of tides, and one of them is to think about Newton in the late 17th century, and he marked a very significant change between the world of Aristotle and the modern world now. And until Newton, it was kind of anybody's guess what was going on with the moon and the tides. I mean, people forever had known that there was some relationship with the moon, but it was just guesswork. How it did it, nobody really knew. And it really wasn't until Newton came along and discovered gravity and the orbital motions of the planets that we were able to get the real first cause, the moon, how the moon actually did it. It wasn't accurate completely, but it was the first time that happened. And of course, during that time, the other thing that was going on was, as you know, that we had the Ptolemaic universe, which was the Earth was the center of the universe, and everything orbited around that. Well, that had to change before the tides could really be figured out. And all that happened during the scientific revolution, from 1450 or so until Newton's time. So it was a pretty exciting thing. And like I said, it wasn't totally accurate, but it was a first beginning there. So one of the myths back then was that, like the Chinese believed that the tides were a dragon going in and out of its cave. That was high tide, low tide. And Leonardo da Vinci believed that there was some animal breathing, and that he tried to calculate the size of its lungs. And on the northwest coast here, we have Flood Tide Woman, who can bring up the tide just by lifting her skirt. So, a couple of the stories that sort of exemplify the complexity of the tide. Aristotle, back in the 4th century BC, he was trying to figure out the tides. And he lived near the Euripus, which is a tidal current area. The Mediterranean doesn't have large tides, but there's a large current area there. And he could not figure it out. And the legend is that he threw himself into the ocean and drowned, saying, "Comprehend me, because I cannot comprehend thee." And then 2,000 years later, when I'm sitting with one of the world's best tide modelers, a guy named David Greenberg in Nova Scotia near the Bay of Fundy, I asked him to describe an aha moment when he was studying the tides, and he was uncharacteristically quiet for a little bit, and then he said, "I don't have moments like that in this field. I only have, oh God, moments when the tide does something I can't understand." So I'm going to read a little bit from one of the chapters. And I don't think I'm going to even introduce it because it's all in here.
Is the light okay now?
I'm good, thanks. I am going to introduce it. This is a tide about, this is a chapter about large tides and how they happen. And it doesn't go into that a lot in this reading here, but I was exploring for one of these chapters, so where are the largest tides in the world and why? How do they happen? It's well below zero and a light snow is falling as I watched Lucas E. Knopfler prepare his snowmobile for hunting. He harnesses a plywood sled called a caliga to his machine and stows a shovel, rifle, can of gas, drinking water, and a torque, a long steel rod sharpened on one end for chopping ice. When the gear is stowed, I swing my leg over the stern of the snowmobile and settle onto the passenger seat. We are ready to leave his village, Kankasuyak, one of the 14 Inuit settlements that cling to the coast of Ungava Bay in northern Quebec, Canada, 200 miles from the Arctic Circle. No roads connect the villages, nor the villages to the city of Quebec and Montreal, 1,000 miles south. Within seconds, we drop onto the frozen surface of Wakem Bay, a 2.5 mile wide slab of ice that heaves up and down with the tide, leaving its edges strewn with automobile-sized ice blocks. We follow a well-worn snowmobile track, which quickly splits in 3 directions. On late winter days like this, Lucasy and other hunters from his village might follow the track leading inland, hunting for Arctic hare and ptarmigan. They might follow the track leading west, looking for seal or walrus. Or during extreme low tides of new and full moon, they might follow the track we have chosen, which leads north 4 or 5 miles toward the bay's opening into Hudson Strait. If conditions are just right, hunters on this track will use their torque to chop a hole in the 3-foot thick ice, and while the tide is out, shimmy into the hollow regions below the frozen bay to forage for fresh blue mussels. I had met Lucasy several years ago and was intrigued by his invitation to join him under the ice. But it had taken 2 winters before he was confident that the ice and tide conditions were just right. Lucasy drives the snowmobile slowly and cautiously over Wakem Bay. But even so, the wind chill, minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, numbs my face and extremities. I am covered almost completely in layers of wool, fleece, goose down, and heavily insulated boots and gloves. Only a small wedge of skin around my goggles is exposed, and it burns in the cold. We skirt the edge of the bay, slowing several times as Lucasy studies the piled up ice and snow marking the intertidal zone. On this side of the bay, the intertidal's wide, gradually sloping transition between land and sea is blurred. In summer, low tide exposed miles of seaweed-covered boulders that provide excellent shellfish gathering. In winter, thick layers of ice accumulate, anchored on one end to the shore. The ice floats as the tide comes in, and when the tide goes out, it's left awkwardly on the ground. Under these riffled and crumpled slabs, cavities form, and they go dry when the tide is out, offering a chance for experienced hunters to gather fresh protein when the summer stores are low and wild game is scarce up above. Lucas stops and turns off the engine, asking me to wait while he pokes around. No, he says, coming back. Not right. Several minutes later, we stop again. This time he comes back with a hint of excitement on his usually stolid face. We gather the shovel and torque and hike over the bank of buckled ice, stopping at a long, steepled fracture running parallel to the shore. Lucas squats for a closer look at the jagged opening. Satisfied, he removes his jacket and chisels at the fracture for half an hour until he breaks through the 3-foot thick ice, shaping a hole about 20 inches in diameter. He wastes no time, no strokes. The window of opportunity opens a couple hours before low tide and snaps shut 4 hours later. This is a window no one wants to miss. Stabbing the torque into the ice as so it stands on his own, Lucas again asks me to wait while he inspects the cavity. His caution, like that of any good hunter, is reasonable, but I am not at all prepared for the feeling of being left suddenly alone while my guide vanishes down a dark hole. I take in hesitantly just how alone I am and just how vast and beautiful and deadly the frozen landscape is. The bay's surface appears quiet and still, but in fact the tide keeps it in constant motion, breaking the silence now and then with ghostly moans and jolting explosions like gunshot as the tide adjusts to the ever-changing conditions below. Before I can think about this too much, Lucas's head bobs back up through the hole. It's good, he says. Lots of muscles and room to forage. He has carved a small foothold in the opening, but the diameter of the hole is too small to allow my knees to bend. After struggling a bit, I realize the only way down is to straighten out and slide. So I do. I let go and drop, landing 6 or 7 feet below the surface in a pile of ice and rock and seaweed. For several minutes, I am completely disoriented by this instant plunge from a bright, frigid upper world into a dark, warm underworld. My glasses and camera fog instantly. The air is close to sea temperature, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 60 degrees warmer than above the ice. As my eyes adapt to the dimness, I notice that the tent-like cavity has a 5-foot-high center ridge that parallels the shoreline. The sides taper out, leaving a foraging area of about 20 feet and 20 feet wide and 100 feet long. The seafloor drops in places, allowing enough headroom for me to stand upright. Muted blue light penetrates from above where the ice is thin and fractured. Large drops of meltwater hang from the ceiling, warping like drips from a slow leaking faucet. The heavy drops slap the bouldered seafloor as they fall, filling the cave with a chorus of snapping fingers. Bits of seaweed and detritus cling randomly to the ceiling, evidence of the last high tide. A crab skitters across the rock and disappears under the seaweed. As I adjust to the eerie surroundings, my breath shallow and quick, I feel like I have dropped into an entirely unknown and unexpected realm, as if the tiny hole carved by Lucas allowed us to slip mysteriously, not just under the ice, but under the surface of the sea. Here, in a dreamlike state, I feel inside the body of the ocean. Pictures of that. So that is Lucas's village, Kangasoo, from the airport.
Where's his village?
Oh, I'm sorry. You see this little cluster of dots there? It's right in the middle to the left. I'm sorry. You see the dark line on the right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the airport. And then the building there, Wakeham Bay is right here, right in the foreground. I think you're going to see a little better picture. So that is his village, Kingsuyak, and we're looking out on Wakeham Bay. And then we took off to the right. And there we are, in under one ice. I was up there for a week, and we did this a number of times. That's right near the hole that we beat down. And that's also Kingasuyak, and that's from Wakeham Bay. One night I went out there. So, like I said before, you can divide the study of tides up into a number of different pieces, but one of the ones that became obvious to me the deeper I got into it was that you could talk about the astronomy, what happens up there, and then you can talk about what they call fluid dynamics, which is what happens down here in the real ocean. And they are they're related inextricably, but the relationship is not always clear and direct, kind of like a marriage. And so from an astronomy view, both the sun and the moon influence the tide. This is going to be pretty elementary, so some of you know this stuff, but I didn't know it when I started, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it right now. All of the motions of the moon and sun and earth, it's all about moon, sun, earth. That's really it. Planets don't really play a role in the tide. But there is a tide, of course, on the ocean, but there is also a tide on the earth. There's a tide underneath the ocean, and there's a tide in the atmosphere. So, if we think about these two, what happens up there and what happens down here, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens up there. So, I'm going to focus just on the moon for right now, because the moon being closer to the earth exerts about almost double the influence that the sun does. The sun does have an influence, for sure, but the moon is the primary influence, and that's why we generally talk about tides and the moon. But let's just say that I am the earth here, and the sun is on my right. So the two main, the big pulses that generate tide are the new and the full moon. So the moon, in the case of the new moon, it's right here. Let's say the sun's that wall. So if the moon is right here, it's new. It's between us and the sun. And we don't see it because the sun is blocking it. And in 29 days, it circles the earth all the way around back to where it was. But every 7 days, it comes to a juncture that's noteworthy. So from here, 7 days, it's new, right? It's barely a sliver. Maybe even we don't even see it. So then it waxes to this point right here. And at that point, it's in first quarter, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it's actually half moon. We see a half moon, but it's called first quarter. So it does that, and then it continues to wax. And over here, of course, it's full moon. Sun's there, the moon's here. We see the reflection of the sun on the moon, so it's full moon. And then it continues, and now it's waning. It goes directly behind me, directly opposite of first quarter, is third quarter. And again, that's a half moon that we see. And then another 7 days, it's back here, at new moon. Everybody with me?
Yes.
So, in this position and in this position, it's aligned. And there's a cool Greek word called syzygy for that. It's called, it's being yoked together. So they're aligned at this point. And when the moon is right here, it's obvious that the sun and moon are working together to create large tides. When the moon comes over here in first quarter, it's at 90 degrees to the sun. So they're working against each other a little bit. So right here, these tides are called spring tides. And then over here, they're called neap tides. Spring tides, by the way, has nothing to do with the season. And over here at quarter, because the sun and moon are working against each other, that's called a neap tide. So spring tide, neap tide, spring tide, neap tide, spring tide. Everybody with me? So I'm going to introduce just one other piece of this. So then we have the fact that the moon doesn't circle the Earth in a perfect circle. So the moon is lopsided. So the moon, as it travels, it's independent of this new moon, quarter, and so forth. But when the moon circles the Earth, there's the moon's orbit. I guess I can't do anything about that, but the sun is over here. So you can see that the moon has an elliptical orbit around the Earth. Sometimes it's 253,000 miles away, and sometimes it's 222 miles away, 1,000 miles away. And that's what makes that what they call a super tide or king tide, or there's lots of popular names for it. But that's what makes it, is when the moon is close to the Earth in that elliptical orbit, it creates more of a gravitational pull. So when it goes out here, and sometimes that can be a difference of a couple of feet in some places. And that happens for a full moon, it happens once or twice a month, and for new moon, once or twice a month that happens. So that's all we're going to do with that. So we just talked about maybe 6 different cycles, right? New moon, full moon, quarter, talked about perigee, apogee, the sun being involved. That's 6 or so cycles of the tide cycles. There are over 400 tide cycles, astronomical tide cycles, all having to do with the relationship of the Earth, Moon, Sun. So, it gets really esoteric. Like, when the moon is closest to the Earth here in perigee, it's also speeding up and it's getting sucked into the Earth a little bit. When it's in apogee, it's slowing down, it's getting pushed away a little bit. So all those things have a partner effect on the ocean. Over 400 of them. So now we're going to talk more about what happens down here. So if you think about all those cycles as notes in a song or an orchestra or drum beats or something like that, then I think about it as a calls from the heaven. So each one of those cycles, like the moon, the full moon, let's just say it has a beat like that. And that beat is at a certain rhythm, like that. And then you have new moon that has a beat too. So there are 400 of these. So you're having, by the time you have it, you've got a lot of different beats coming together. And when you come down to the ocean hears those in different ways. So some oceans hear one beat. One ocean might hear that beat loud, and another ocean might hear it softly or faintly. And next door, just 2 miles away, another ocean or basin or whatever might hear a whole different song from the heavens. And that is, in essence, how the tides work. And what that's all about is resonance. It's about vibration. So down here, every basin has a particular kind of vibration, what they call a natural period of oscillation, which is it's the frequency that if you hit something, that's what it would vibrate at. And we know this from singing in the shower. You hit that note, then there's that vibration. We know it even in the bathtub if we start swinging like this. And if you swing at a certain period, you kind of get that wave to the slosh. But if you do something like that, it will stop it. We also know it in a swing. So we're pushing a child on a swing, and if you push at just the right time, it either maintains the swing or makes it grow, right? If we don't, we push way down low, it stops it. So we know that's that. So what we're doing is we're doing something that's making that swing resonate. Guitar strings do it, violins, I mean, it's everywhere. Leaves have vibration, everything has vibration. So ocean basins have vibration periods, and they're all different. So when we look out on the ocean here, not particularly here, but let's say a little broader area, what we see as one basin is actually, it could be 2 or 3 or 10 basins. The Pacific has hundreds of basins within it, and those are defined by the depth of the ocean, the shape, the length, the width, the salinity, the temperature, all that stuff. And that creates a vibration period for that basin. So what one of the oceanographers told me, which I think works very well, a story, is he said, it's as if you have a table, and let's just take this table, and we took a lot of different pans of water. A really big round flat pan, a tall, really narrow one, all different shapes. And we set them on here, and then we poured water into them at different levels. And then we started kicking the leg with a rhythm, right? That might represent any one of those astronomical cycles that we mentioned. Well, when you look at the pans, they're all going to vibrate differently. They're all going to respond differently. Some of them won't respond at all. Some of them will be really excited, right? That's exactly what happens in the oceans. So you have all those cycles, but you don't have just one cycle. You've got lots of them. But again, some of them are really loud and prominent, like the full moon, new moon cycle is probably the largest, most significant cycle. And then that perigee is another one. But what NOAA uses to create tide charts, they use 60 cycles, usually. 60 different cycles. Because as you start to get beyond them, the differences are very small, and they don't need to know the differences so much. I was just over in Italy talking to them about their tide gates that they're doing to protect the city. And they used to use just eight of these rhythms to determine their tide, because their tide is only 3 feet. Now, since they've been working on this tide gate issue, they use 89. And the guy told me that the additional 80 rhythms that they use to determine the tide there gave them a resolution of 1.5 inches on the tide. Yeah. So there are 12 really prominent tide cycles. They call them harmonic constituents. But beyond that, you start to get, it goes on and on and on and on. So anyway, I'm going to read you just a quick little section that kind of finished that piece out here. This is from the book. So resonance introduces a new dimension to our thinking about tides. This is from the resonance chapter, that where we once had a concept of the sun and moon pushing and pulling the oceans around the earth, we now know that the ocean itself plays an active role in creating the tide. The sun and moon call out, as it were, and the oceans call back. The world's oceans are not passive listeners, but partners in an energetic conversation that ultimately accentuates or diminishes the tide. The sun and moon's call is the gravitational force generated by any one of the hundreds of orbiting cycles. Depending on their resonating characteristics, the oceans call back, sometimes with enthusiasm and sometimes with apparent disinterest. Like a mother who singles out her child's voice among the many voices in the playground, some ocean basins are so finely tuned to one astronomical signal that they don't hear the other voices. So I'm going to finish. I know we want some time for, maybe I should not do this.
Oh, do it.
Really? I just do it? Okay, I'll make it shorter. This is from the introduction, the last of the introduction. The tides rise and fall constantly in all the world's coastlines, more than 375,000 of them. In places, the range is small, like the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the South Pacific Islands. And in other places, it's large, like northwestern Australia, Patagonia, the United Kingdom, and northeastern Canada. Large or small, the tide is always on the move, swelling against one coast while shrinking from another. It never begins, and it never ends. As I write this, I imagine what the tide might be doing around the world right now. Where I live, it's low, and oyster grower Nick Jones is out on the flats with his crew, repairing beds, planting spat, and harvesting oysters for market. While he hauls burlap bags up the intertidal, a large heron in Suriname lifts its blue-black body from the roost and squawks loudly as it wings toward the coast. Its destination is miles from sight, but an internal clock signals that the tide is low, and a meal of mussels, urchins, and crabs await. As the bird alights on the seaweed-covered rocks, David Plunkett dons a white apron and opens the sluice gate at the Ealing Tide Mill, south of London. In minutes, the 16th century mill, the oldest operating in the world, moans to life, and warm yellow flour spills from the grinding wheels. Later, when the tide is low and the wheels are again still, the flour will be delivered to Red Farm and mill bakeries to be made into cookies and bread. When those cookies are in the oven, Lucas Napaluk might be cutting a hole in the Arctic ice and preparing to drop below into the womb-like hollows left behind by an extreme low tide. In that dark, ice-roofed cabin, he harvests fresh blue mussels for dinner. Thousands of miles away in Venice, Italy, a young couple sits at a small table, their hands entwined. In the fading evening light, they gaze at each other and a full moon rising over Piazza San Marco. There's nothing unusual about this romantic scene, except that the couple's chairs are sitting in 16 inches of seawater. It's Acqua Alta in Venice. High tide has jumped the seawall and flooded San Marco Square, something that has happened occasionally for centuries, but more frequently in recent years, about 100 times in 2015. Though these floodings pose a serious threat, Venetians are accustomed to it. Visitors walk on raised wood planks and shop in rubber boots. The young couple can still order a cappuccino, but the server who brings it is wearing hip waders. Acqua Alta might not contribute to Venice's romance, but a full moon certainly does. Who can gaze upon the bright companion and not feel inspired? No wonder our ancestors thought of it as a mother, father, God, death, renewal. They understood long before science revealed the details that the moon and tides were connected, mirroring each other as they rise and fall, grow and shrink, die, and are reborn. Cultures of the not-too-distant past played music and danced to the moon, celebrating fertility, ripeness, love. That moon is the same one we see today, the one that reminds us of where we came from. A century ago, Yeats said, "What is there in thee, moon, that thou shouldst move my heart so potently?" The moon may move our hearts today, but our first love was the ocean, stirred millions of years ago. The attraction may have grown stronger or weaker through time, but the affair has never ended. Like any relationship, it has complexities and baggage. The moon calls out to the Earth's oceans in the form of gravity, and the oceans call back their pulsing energy, holding the moon close, while at the same time pushing it away. It's a dance performed celestially, with partners on a dance floor across hundreds of thousands of miles. It brings new meaning to the concept of a long-distance relationship. And from the perspective of human life, the dance never had a beginning or an end. Such power, such love, such desire.